Oh, yeah.
Cards in the newly fully spoiled set Zendikar Rising. I've prepared a list of what my top 10 modern cards are. Some of them are just sort of picks that I think might be sleepers, and some of them are pretty obvious. You know, my number one's probably going to be the same as everyone's number one. But there will be some surprises in there. So I'm going to open up chat on my phone, and we'll just get started. All right. As always, this is brought to you by StevensvilleGamers, and that's where it'll be posted to YouTube afterward if you want to watch it, help you sort of prepare for modern post-Zendikar Rising. Just a disclaimer, I don't think this is going to shake up Modern in any big way. There will be a couple of cards that I think will be added to sideboards. I don't think this will push any archetypes into prevalence, but I do think there are some neat new toys in here for a couple archetypes. So let's get into it. Number 10, speaking of new toys for kind of on the fringe archetypes, this is Yasharn, Implaceable Earth. 2, a green and a white for a 4/4 legendary elemental boar. When it enters the battlefield, you get to fetch a forest and a plains, both basic, and put them in your hand. And players can't pay life or sacrifice non-land permanents to cast spells or activate abilities. Now, this shuts down a lot of different stuff. It shuts down fetch lands. Death Shadow has a bit of a harder time because some of their effects want to pay life. And things you can't crack fetches. That's the big thing. There's plenty of other things that want to sacrifice. The more that you play with this card, I feel like the more you're going to realize it has niche implications. It has niche places where that ability is relevant. Do I think it's going to be a big modern card? No. But there's a sort of green-white blink deck that, it's my girlfriend's deck. She plays a lot, and it's a pet deck of mine. I really want to see it succeed. Where you sort of vial in, like, Princes, Flicker Wisps, Restos, and you're blinking Eternal Witnesses, Night of Autumns for some flexibility, Blade Splicers, and I think this would go as a shoe-in there. It shuts down your opponent's fetches, but you don't mind blinking it because it takes 2 lands out of your deck. Make sure you can cast those Thrag Tusks on the top end and activate your Gavany Townships because you'll be sort of flooded with land. It'll also fill up your hand, which is useful in some cases, like especially against a Liliana of the Veil. You'll have a handful of land, so you'll never have to worry about discarding something good to her plus. So I think this card has some interesting ramifications. It might be the kind of thing that you put a one of in cord decks just to kind of get your opponent on those uncracked fetches or on something else that they're trying to do. There's just a lot of corner cases where these effects are relevant. Next, we've got Jace Mirror Mage. Now, this is an incredibly slow card, but, Jace the Mind Sculptor has proven itself to be good, and the only difference between, well, I don't want to say the only difference, but that card is not super good at interacting with threats that can deal with it. This card can't interact with threats that can deal with it at all, but it does offer some insane card advantage, especially in the modern format where so many cards are so cheap. So it's 1 in double blue for a legendary Planeswalker, Jace, 4 starting loyalty, kicker 2. If you kick it, you get another copy that's a token and non-legendary. Now it's +1 scries you 2, and it's 0 draws you a card and reveals it, and removes a number of loyalty counters equal to that card's mana cost from Jace Mirror Mage. Now, if you're talking about a lot of modern decks, you're not playing a lot of expensive cards. So you're only going to be revealing or losing 1 or 2, maybe 3 loyalty off of the Jace each time, which is really good. And the starting loyalty, the token as well. But essentially, if you have 2 of these, one of them can be scrying to make sure there's a cheap good card you want on top of your deck with that +1 that scries 2, and then the other one can be drawing you that cheap good card. So it's got sort of self-synergy. And it's only 5 mana to get both copies, which, when you think about it, like, those decks are playing Teferi, and they're happy to play Teferi. He's the same cost as Teferi to kick. He's the same cost, or he's one more than Jace the Mind Sculptor, and you can just cast the 1 of this and feel all right about zeroing it and then just scrying with it when its loyalty gets too low, or just letting it die. You're likely to draw 2 or 3 cards off of this in Modern, possibly 4, even 5 if you hit several lands, just with the 1 copy that costs 3 and just using the 0 over and over again. So I think this card's got a lot of potential, and people are sleeping on it a little bit more than I'd like them to. Up next, number 8, we've got Wayward Guide Beast. This is definitely not Goblin Guide. I'm not in the camp of people who thinks that this card is going to be the next Goblin Guide. But it is certainly something to be looked at. So it is a red for a 2/2 Trample Haste Beast. Whenever Wayward Guide Beast deals combat damage to a player, return a land you control to its owner's hand. Now, in the mono-red burn lists, this really isn't that much of a downside. You're going to be capping off at 2 or 3 lands if you're drawing well, and so at that point, it can honestly be a mana advantage. You're not going to have a land necessarily to hit. The disadvantage between this and Goblin Guide is Goblin Guide can be played on turn 1 safely. If you play this on turn 1 and you start swinging with it, you're really never going to get to play 2 lands at once. You're going to be stuck on casting 1 spell per turn. But if you play one of these on turn 2, you can still empty your hand as fast as Burn ever would, and you're not giving your opponent potential cards and information for both of you that you'd be getting off of Goblin Guide. So I think this is a card to be looked at. There are probably going to be mono-red aggro decks, maybe a couple color aggro decks that want this in Modern. An honorable mention is the color-shifted Steplinks, the red Steplinks, which has a lot of synergy with this. So if this sees play in Modern, I would not be surprised if it is alongside that card. Next is number 7. We've got Arkhan of Ameria. Now this is a classic hate bear. 2 and a white for a 2/3 Arkhan with flying. Each player can't cast more than 1 spell each turn, and non-basic lands your opponent control enter the battlefield tapped. This is a huge shutter on fetches and shocks. You know, the fetch is going to come in tapped, and then what you crack it for, unless you grab a basic land, is going to come in tapped. And then they can't cast more than 1 spell each turn, so Storm can't win until they take this out. Burn is not going to be able to double spell, so it's going to slow them down and give you time to find your life gain. Uro piles. This hurts Tron quite a bit as well. Their Tron lands and their Eldrazi temples and whatnot are going to be coming in tapped, so you're going to be able to be a little bit faster in finding your ghost quarters or just outspeeding them. So yeah, I like this card. A lot of people like this card. We'll see if 3 mana puts it out of playability when you compare it to like Thalia, but people were sometimes playing Thalia Heretic Cathar, the second one, which is creatures and non-basic lands your opponent's control under tapped, and it's a 3/2 first strike for 3. And I think this is definitely better than that for what it's worth. So we'll see if this sees any play. I'm optimistic. Number 6, Scourge of the Skyclaves is 1 and a black for a demon. Kicker, 4 and a black. When you cast this spell, if it was kicked, each player loses half their life, rounded up. Scourge of the Skyclave's power and toughness are each equal to 20 minus the highest life total among players. So you might notice some similarities between this and a Modern All-Star Death Shadow. I don't think this card is going to be the next Death Shadow, but it's certainly pretty good. Now, it goes off of the highest life total, so you have to be taking your opponent's life total down as fast as you're taking yours down, which is not impossible. You know, if you've just bolted them once, then this is a 3/3 if you've been fetching and shocking. So I think this guy will get pretty big pretty quickly. I would say that this definitely has the potential to be Modern playable. If it is, it'll obviously be in Death Shadow. I don't know how many copies the deck is going to want to play, if this will just be a 4 of as well, or if they'll just want 2 of this maybe. But it has a lot of synergy with my number 1 pick, which incidentally is also a card that wants to be in Modern Death Shadow. So, Scourge of the Skyclave, something to look out for. That kicker is really misleading. You're pretty much never going to cast it for the kicker. But, let's look at the next card. Confounding Conundrum. 1 in a blue for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card. And whenever a land enters the battlefield under opponent's control, if that player had another land enter the battlefield under their control this turn, they return a land they control to its owner's hand. Now, this does not hose fetches like everyone says that it is. It's a little bit annoying because they can't crack them the turn that they come in, but they can still crack the fetch on your turn and they get the land because it's a different turn, so they haven't had a land enter yet, so they don't have to return it to their hand. What this is really good against is the Uro piles decks, and the decks that are playing like Ren and 6 style stuff, because those decks want to play multiple lands in one turn. They want to, like if they play Primeval Titan, they want to like fetch a bunch of stuff, trigger a bunch of stuff. This sort of stops that. It prevents them from actually, like they get the enter the battlefield triggers, so if they've already got field online, they're going to be getting some zombies. But the hope is you get this out before they get field online, and then their Uros are sort of blank. Their Uros just kind of let them draw a card and gain 3 life, because they put the land in, and then they immediately have to return a land they control to their hand. This card will be good against those. Time will tell whether it's enough to stop those decks, and I really don't think it is. I think Uro needs a ban, or field, something to shake up the Modern meta. But this card will certainly be a nice tool to have in your toolkit for as long as those decks still exist. That's Confounding Conundrum. So number 4 is a bit controversial. I know this doesn't do much all the time. It is 1 and a white. It's Luminaric Aspirant, 1 and a white for 1/1 Human Cleric. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. I know it's slow, but there are going to be aggressive decks that want this, okay? Or mid-rangey style decks that want this. Tokens might want this. Just some Stoneforge-y mid-range decks might want this. Hate Bears might want this. Just keep putting counters on your Thalia, and it gets to trade with everything. Of course, it dies to removal. I'm not discounting that, but I think the card has a lot of potential. You know, the turn it comes in, even if you don't have any other creatures, it gets to put a counter on itself, or it can go ahead and put a counter on your Thraben Inspector or your Giver of Runes. And then, like, if you're against an aggressive deck, you just put enough counters on something that it can block whatever, and then you can start putting counters on something to swing with. It really lets you get into the mid-game against aggro decks. And against decks that pack removal, they kind of have to remove this, or it's going to get out of control. It's going to make all of your guys a lot bigger. So I think this card will get slept on. I don't know if it necessarily deserves the number 4 spot, but I think for how underrated it is definitely something that needs to be taken seriously. It also worth noting it might see some play in Humans if Humans comes back. I want this to see play in some kind of Hate Bears list. I think it'll be really cool. So that's Luminaric Aspirant. This might be my favorite card of the set, personally. So we're going into number 3. Now this is Seagate Stormcaller. That's a lot of text. We got a Yu-Gi-Oh card right here. It's 1 and a blue for a 2/1 human wizard with kicker 4 and a blue. When it enters the battlefield, copy the next instant or sorcery spell with converted mana cost 2 or less you cast this turn when you cast it. If Seagate Stormcaller was kicked, copy that spell twice instead. You may choose new targets for the copies. You're hardly ever going to kick this, right? Maybe when you top deck it's super late in the game. But this could be Snapcasters 5 through 8 for decks that want it. And it's simple. It changes some lines of play. So you don't have to already have the spell in your yard. You have to have it in your hand. So let's go over some really powerful lines of play that this could see in Modern. I'm talking Grixis Control right now. On turn 3, you know, they've got 2 creatures. You play Seagate Stormcaller, you bolt one of their creatures, you copy the bolt, and hit one of their other creatures. That's awesome. That's basically the bolt, snap, bolt line of play, except you got to cast both of the bolts on turn 3. You didn't have to do anything before. You could be Serum Visioning or something like that, or Thought Seizing. Speaking of Thought Seize, turn 3, if you know you're not against an aggressive deck and you can handle losing 4 life, you play Seagate Stormcaller, Thought Seize. Take 2 cards out of their hand and lose 4 life. Like, that's really, really good. Or, if you just want some card advantage, turn 3, Seagate Stormcaller, Serum Visions, or Opt. You know, just dig through your deck on turn 3, and it leaves behind a 2/1 body that your opponent's going to have to answer. So yeah, Seagate Stormcaller I think is going to be insane. I think we're getting into the territory of cards that I think have a pretty much 100% chance of seeing play in Modern, and Seagate Stormcaller I'm definitely comfortable putting on that list. So Seagate Stormcaller is a clear card to watch out for. I think it's going to be amazing, and yeah, keep your eye on it. It's the second coming of Snapcaster. I'm calling it right now. So, Maya, I can't pet you right now. I love you. Do you want to say hi? Do you want to say hi to my stream? You want to say hi to my stream? This is Maya. She's my dog. So Roiling Vortex is 1 and a red for an enchantment. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, Roiling Vortex deals 1 damage to them. Whenever a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast that spell, Roiling Vortex deals 5 damage to that player. And for 1 red, your opponents can't gain life this turn. This card just does it all. I think this card will definitely see some play in Modern Burn, and I have my eye out for this card in the Legacy, okay? At the beginning of each player's upkeep, Roiling Vortex deals 1 damage to them. That's awesome. That's really good. That's going to slowly kill your opponent. It's sort of like an Eidolon of Revels, but it's going to kill a little slower, but it also doesn't die to creature removal. Now these other 2 abilities, whenever a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, Roiling Vortex deals 5 damage to that player. That's kind of insane, right? Like, I mean, just think of all of the free spells that get cast in Modern. You're gonna profit off of this in a great way. All the suspend spells that are popular, anything that comes off of Bloodbraid Elf is gonna hit your opponent for 5. That's a quarter of their life. Like, and this is a 2 mana enchantment, so that's insane. I mean, your opponent always has the choice to not cast those spells, but when they're having to choose not to advance their game plan just to not take 5 damage from your 2-drop, you're in a really good place. And then that last ability is just icing on the cake. Any 2 of these abilities, any 2 of these 3 abilities, and I would have said this card was viable in Modern, but all 3 just makes it an all-star, instant Modern Classic. The thing about this last ability is, like, let's say you're against Soul Sisters, you just leave up a mana every turn, and they can't actually gain life. They lose the advantage that they have against Burn. Or let's say you're against a Stoneforge type deck. Every time they swing with their Batter Skull, just pay a red, and they can't gain life this turn. It's just super, super strong against them. I cannot sing this card's praises enough, and this is... Personally, I think I had trouble deciding between this and the card that actually got number 1, but I have to be realistic. The card that got number 1 is already is going to see play in a deck that's already top tier, so it would be silly not to give it number 1. So we're going to move on to number 1, and I'll show you what it is. Agadim's Awakening. I realize now I should have put the land side in this slide too, but it is X and triple black for a sorcery. Return from your graveyard to the battlefield any number of target creature cards that each have a different converted mana cost, X or less. So, you pay 1 into it, you get a Death Shadow back. You pay 2 into it, you get a Death Shadow and a Snapcaster, or the 2-drop Death Shadow from earlier in the list. You pay 3 into it, you get all of that, plus... Just kidding, no one plays 3-drop creatures in Modern. So... This card is also flexible in another way. You can play it on its backside as a land that comes in tapped unless you pay 3 life. Now, what deck would love to pay 3 life for a land it's putting in? Death's Shadow. Sometimes that deck will pay a mana and a card just to bolt itself. Imagine if just your land coming in did that. I can see Death's Shadow going a lot harder into black, maybe being a black deck with a splash of red. Or just like a Grixis deck where both the other colors are splashed, just going much harder into black so that they can play Agadim's Awakening safely. They might introduce that the 2-drop from earlier in the list into the list, and they're definitely going to be playing these. The only issue is if you're cutting lands for these, you're going to be less consistent on colors, which is why I said they're more likely to lean into black if they want to play this. But even just the backside, like, you're hardly ever going to use this actual spell side, but just the backside that's a swamp that bolts you when it comes in. It's going to be really useful for Death Shadow. For those who don't know, Death Shadow is a 1-mana 13/13 that gets -X, where X is your life total. So as long as you have less than 13 life, it gets bigger and bigger. And if you have, like, 2 life, it's a 1-mana 11/11. If you have 5 life left, it's a 1-mana 8/8. That's the card that we're referencing. So yeah, this card is going to enable those decks in a big way. They might go back to being the sort of number 1 thing in Modern, and I honestly wouldn't mind that. There's so much degeneracy at the top decks of Modern. Uro piles, Wars, none of it's fun to play against. So yeah, that has been our list of the top 10 Modern cards in Zendikar Rising. I hope that you enjoyed it. I want you to go down to the comments and leave me your picks for the top 10 cards of Zendikar Rising. I know my list has differed from other people's in pretty big ways. I want you to argue with me. Tell me what you think about my picks. Tell me what your picks are. And just have a fun discussion in the comments. With that said, I will see you next week with more Fred's Magic Hour. Have a good one.